Here we are. Okay, we're back. Okay, what we want to do is now is we want to just talk a little bit about the structure of the central nervous system. There are multiple parts: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. But I think the best place to start is probably the cerebrum because the thing that we're most accustomed to and most familiar with. But it's a lot more intricate than what you'd ever expect. So let's talk about the cerebrum today. First of all, to start out with, again, these are the divisions of the brain. We're going to talk about the cerebrum, which is also called the telencephalon. The telencephalon. We also have the diencephalon, the midbrain or the mesencephalon, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum, which we'll talk about in subsequent videos. So those will be coming up. More exciting things coming up. But that's what today. Let's talk about the cerebrum because this is where there's a lot of excitement here. This is sort of the flash. This is the glitz that we have on top of everything, where everything that happens in the background, all the the stage hands and everything, is the diencephalon, midbrain, pons. They're really important. The show doesn't go on without them, but the flash is what happens on the outside, and that's the cerebrum. So let's talk about that. First of all, when we look at the cerebrum, if you go out about Halloween time and you buy a little plastic brain, you're going to see all these little bumps all over there, or little folds all over the tape. And these little bumps or ridges or folds are called gyri. That would be gyri, or gyrus would be singular, okay? And between all these folds or these ridges or these little elevated areas are grooves, and these grooves are called sulci. Okay, so we have gyri, which are the bumps, and the sulci were the grooves. You'd have to probably figure out the sulci because going back to when we talked about bones and bone markings, a sulcus we knew was a groove in a bone. The cerebrum is also divided by what we call fissures. Okay, and these fissures are longitudinal cracks that are deep inside the brain, and they divide the brain into major cortical divisions, or into what we call lobes. Okay, the first fissure that we have is called the longitudinal fissure, and that runs from anterior to posterior, anterior, whichever one you want. Doesn't make a difference. It divides the right side of the brain, the right cerebral hemisphere, from the left side of the brain, or the left cerebral hemisphere. So, and what happens is the right side of the brain, interestingly enough, supplies most of the motor activity to the left side of the body, and the left side of the left cerebral hemisphere supplies most of the motor activity to the right side of the body. We'll talk about that a little bit later, how that happens. We also find that dividing the brain into an anterior portion and a portion that's a little bit more posterior, there's called the central sulcus, or the central fissure, and that divides the frontal lobe, which is the part up in the front, from the part in the middle and towards the back, which is called the parietal lobe. And I'll show you some diagrams of what that is. So far now I have the longitudinal fissure, or longitudinal sulcus, goes around. Fissure is probably a better word in this case because it's much deeper. Longitudinal fissure, and a central sulcus, or a central fissure, that goes from side to side, dividing the front from the middle to the back. Okay, we also have a lateral sulcus, which is over on the lateral side, and I'll show you a diagram of this, and that divides sort of the temporal lobe, which sits in front of the ear, from the frontal and parietal lobe. The frontal lobe here and the parietal lobe, which would be on the side. And that makes sense simply because if we look at the skull, this area was a temporal bone, this area was a frontal bone, this area was the parietal bone, which pretty much corresponds with the cerebral the lobe of the cerebral cortex that we see. So let's look at a picture of this. Now this is a picture. This would be anterior. So let me get this out here. This would be the anterior portion out here, and posterior back in here. So we're looking, this would be the right side over here, this would be the left side over here. And what happens is that we divide the brain. Let me get a different color here that'll show you. We divide the brain right down the middle, okay, with this longitudinal fissure that divides the brain into a right cerebral hemisphere, which would be on this side, and a left cerebral hemisphere, which would be on this side. Okay, they pretty much mimic each other, but we'll talk about some of the differences much later on down the road. So that's my longitudinal fissure. Then we also have a fissure that comes from side to side. Okay, let me use a different color here. Let me use maybe purple. Yeah, purple sounds like right. And this is fissure that comes like this, and it sort of divides this area of the brain, which is the frontal lobe, from this blue area right here. It's not really blue, that's just for diagrammatic purposes, which should be the parietal lobe. It divides that. So there's a fissure here. So now I have the brain with the longitudinal fissure here. I have a central sulcus, or a central fissure, that goes this way. The third fissure that we have is a lateral fissure, or lateral sulcus, and that's right in here. This area right here, the purple area, is the temporal lobe. We have a lot of hearing and stuff like that. And here's the frontal lobe, and here's the parietal lobe. So that little fissure or sulcus right here divides the parietal lobe and maybe a little bit of the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe down in here. Okay, so this is looking from the top. This is looking from directly from the side. We can't see the longitudinal because it would be down in this crack right there, and that's what we see in regards to the fissures and how the brain is sort of divided. Now, when we look at the brain, we could divide the brain into various lobes. We have a frontal lobe, we have a right frontal and a left frontal. We have a parietal lobe, a right parietal and a left parietal. We have an occipital lobe, a right occipital and left occipital, and we have a temporal lobe, a right temporal and left temporal lobe. Okay, so if I'm really looking at a diagram that will show that, this is very rudimentary, but the frontal area would be the area that we see up in here in purple. Okay, the parietal lobe would be this area right here that I have in green. The occipital lobe would be back in here, that's in yellow, and let's take the red for the temporal lobe down in here. So that sort of divides the brain into 4 different lobes. Again, there'd be 8 because 4 on the right, 4 on the left. So frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, and I think that's important to know. Now, the reason why that's there like that is because there are different functions that occur in each section of the brain. I'll map these out for you in just a little bit and show you how that occurs. But that's the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe. Again, divided by the fissure that comes down this way divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and then here's my lateral fissure right here. You know, this would be that central fissure right here. Here's the lateral fissure right here that divides the parietal lobe and a little bit of the frontal from the temporal lobe. Okay. Again, like I mentioned before, the cerebral hemispheres are called the telencephalon. It's really basically the largest singular portion of the brain. Now let's go back and let's think back just a couple weeks ago before the spring break when we looked inside the cranium, we looked inside that skull. And what we saw was when we looked in the front of the skull, inside that cranial, inside the cranium itself, we saw the anterior cranial fossa, which was higher. Then we saw the middle cranial fossa, which was a little bit lower, and the posterior cranial fossa, which was much lower. So what happens is these fosses actually support various portions of the brain. What happens is the cerebral hemispheres occupy actually the majority of the anterior and middle cranial fossae. Okay. What about the posterior? Well, the posterior cranial fossa, that lowish portion in the back, basically what sits inside there is going to be the cerebellum, and the cerebrum, or the occipital lobe, the back portion of the brain of the cerebrum, sits on top of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum sits inside that posterior cranial fossa. So the posterior cranial fossa would be, if I do a picture down like here, that middle cranial fossa is like this, and the anterior cranial fossa is here. So the frontal lobe sits in here, the temporal lobe sits in here, and the cerebellum sits in here, but the occipital lobe would sit here, and the parietal lobe sits way above everything else up in here. Okay. We also know that the cerebral hemispheres contain what we call the ventricular part of the ventricular system of the brain. Okay, they contain what are called the lateral ventricles, and we'll talk more about this in one of our last videos in the neurological system. What happens is these ventricles have actually special cells in there that produce something called cerebral spinal fluid, or the fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. That fluid is made actually within the body of the brain. In the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere, there's this large C-shaped area which are called the lateral ventricles. There's a right lateral ventricle and a left lateral ventricle, and what the right lateral ventricle do and the left lateral ventricle does is they actually come together to a ventricle that's right in the middle, which is called the third ventricle. So the lateral ventricles feed into the third ventricle, which is in the middle of the brain, and the third ventricle feeds downwards to what's called the fourth ventricle, and from the fourth ventricle it feeds out through channels that will actually provide the cerebral spinal fluid that will cover the whole brain as well as down the spinal cord. And so part of the ventricular system that makes the cerebral spinal fluid is in the cerebral hemispheres on both sides, and a part on the right side, part on the left side, and we'll show that a little bit later. This is basically just, let me get rid of these yellow marks here and the red marks. Let me erase those real quick to get them out of the way so you're able to see a little bit better. This is just a brain that's been cut in half. Okay, so I look at this brain, it's sort of been cut in half. We'll talk about this later on, where the right side of the brain connects to the left side of the brain. But this up in here is all that cerebral cortex. It's all the cerebral cortex. This back in here would be the area of the occipital lobe. Okay, this area up in here would be the area of the parietal lobe, and then this area out in here would be the area of the frontal lobe. Okay, and we'll talk about that. The temporal lobe is actually tucked in right down here because you can't see it. This side's, the right side's been cut off, and this is on the left side. This area back here is a cerebellum, which we'll talk about in another video down the road. But what happens is that this is the brain that we see. This area right here would be how the brain would look right down if we took the brain and put our hands in that longitudinal fissure and separate it. That's what we'd see. We'd see that this surface of the brain right here, because that brain is split into right side and left side. It's connected together right here at this point, but up in here I have the right side and the left side. They'll be opposite each other. Okay, that's pretty easy to figure that one out. Now what happens is when we look at the cerebrum, there are a number of things that happen in there. We have one area is called the motor area, the motor control. Now we talked a lot about that when we talked about muscle activity and muscle action in a previous video. And what happens is that stimulus that will actually start the electrical impulse that goes down to the muscle begins with what we call the motor cortex, and I'll show you exactly where that's at. I'll show you exactly where that's at, and we'll talk about that. That's where we initiate muscle contraction. We also have sensory areas. So when we talked in an earlier video about receptors, like touch, pain, temperature, vibration, stuff like that. These receptors then the receptors are in the exterior portion of our body, and brings that signal afferently back up to the brain, and they end up in a certain area which is called the sensory region, okay, or the sensory portion of the brain. And I'll show you exactly where that is. And once that signal gets up there, the brain then interprets that sensory information, which we talked about a lot before in regards to how we maintain homeostasis. Also, there are parts of the brain that involve emotion, and these are areas in the frontal lobe and in the temporal lobe. Frontal lobe up in front and in the temporal lobe. And there's a portion called the limbic system, which is involved with being awake or being asleep. Affect. Affect means how you appear externally. Some people have a very bubbly affect, which means they're very, very excited and bubbly. Other people have a very blunted affect, and they're very bland. And a lot of that's controlled in these emotional areas in the frontal and the temporal lobe. Years ago, when people had emotional related problems, a lot of times what they did is they take them in, and this would be done in the office or in a surgical suite somewhere. And what they do is they'd numb up above in the area of the orbit, just underneath that supraorbital ridge, which we all know, and then take a spike and put this spike up inside through the skull and into that area of the frontal lobe, and they'd scramble it. They'd scramble it on both sides, and that was called a frontal lobotomy. So they actually go in and scramble up the brain with this pick, like an ice pick from the outside, going up through there, and then scramble it up. John Kennedy had a sister, and his sister had some emotional related problems, and John Kennedy's father, one day without the knowledge of anybody else in the family, took his sister to a hospital in Boston, and they did a frontal lobotomy, and she ended up being institutionalized for the rest of her life. So I guess it didn't work very well. But anyway, so we have emotions in that frontal lobe and in the temporal lobe. We have a couple different speech areas. One area is called Broca's area, which is sort of like where the frontal lobe meets very close to the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, and that's a motor speech area, and I'll show you exactly where that is. That's the area that will guide how I sound words and the process of actually mechanically forming speech. There's another area which is called Wernicke's, which is a little bit more towards the occipital area, occipital parietal area, which is a little bit more in interpretation of speech. Sometimes people, when they have a problem that involves Broca's area, that mechanical, they have difficult time mouthing the words. They might know what the words are in their brain, but they have a difficult time mouthing it. Where, in other words, if people have a problem with Wernicke's area, which is a little bit more posterior in the integration or the evaluation of speech, to say the right words. Sometimes they'll say the wrong word. Sometimes they can't put words together. Syntax becomes a problem, and all kinds of problems. There's a number of different things they call. The term for that would be aphasia. Aphasia, where they have a difficult time speaking for one reason or another. Sometimes it's motor, Broca. Sometimes it's putting the words together, the right words, the context, the meanings, and stuff like that. And that would be largely Wernicke's. We also have, so that would be speech areas. We also have visual cortex. That visual cortex is sort of in the back. We'd think think that it would be up closer to the eyes, but it's very much in the back. It's in the occipital lobe, and majority of it's actually tucked inside that longitudinal fissure in that occipital lobe in the back of the skull. If you remember when we talked in the lab how the eyeballs have an optic nerve that comes out of it at an angle, and they go through that optic foramen in the orbit, and then what happens is part of the fibers, once they get inside the cranium, part of them will cross. The part from the right eye might go to the half, it go to the left eye, half from the left eye goes to the right eye, and part of it goes straight back. So we have that mixed fiber from both the right eye and left eye as it goes back in the brain. Finally it gets back into the posterior aspect, which is basically in the occipital lobe, and that's where I'm able to perceive that vision in that occipital lobe. You ever notice when you fall on your back of your head, you start to see stars? Maybe what you're doing is you're rattling your occipital lobe a little bit. Memory and intellect occurs in multiple different areas throughout the brain, and it's hard to really pinpoint a lot of that. And what they realize, and a lot of the neuroscience research at this point is talking about, and I've mentioned this to a couple people in regards to study habits and stuff like that, sometimes it's not the time that you spend studying, but the number of times you repeat it. And what they realize is by the number of times it repeats it, it starts to increase synaptic connections between adjacent neurons, which then enhances that memory and that intellect. Okay, and we'll talk. You know, we mentioned that a little bit before, but we probably won't mention a whole lot more about after that. Okay, now let's talk about the motor cortex first. The motor cortex is really important, okay, and you would think it would be a huge area, but it's not, okay. What happens is, let's think back of the brain, okay. We know we have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, it's divided by that longitudinal fissure, and we know we have that central fissure, or that central sulcus, that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, just behind that. What happens is this primary motor cortex region that we have, the primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus. So just in front of that central sulcus, central fissure, the hump of brain tissue, the hump of cerebrum just in front of that is actually the primary motor area, the primary motor cortex. Okay, and what happens is along that, from all the way from where it starts, where the frontal lobe starts at that central sulcus near the base of the brain, all the way to the top and then down along the longitudinal fissure, we have various specific areas of the body that are represented, and I'll show you that. That's called the homunculus. And what we'll talk a little bit about the importance of the homunculus, because the size of the homunculus, or the size of the representation in the cerebral cortex, depends proportionally to the amount of control that I need in the muscle. I need a lot of control around some of my facial muscles to be able to provide, you know, to have the muscles providing for speech. My fingers, they have to be very dexterous, so therefore I have a very large representation in this motor homunculus. I'll show you that. Also in that motor cortex, I should talk about Broca's speech area, and that's that motor area, and I'll show you exactly where it is. It's in the frontal lobe, very close to that lateral cerebral sulcus, almost like where the frontal lobe meets this parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. So if I took at the brain right here, this is the brain, this would be anterior out here, so this is anterior here, this is posterior here. Let me get rid of some of these other marks here, I'll get them out of the way. Okay, and if I look right here, let me show you, right here is that central sulcus. It comes down that way. So if I'm drawing a line along that central sulcus, let me draw that in purple just to be continuous with that. It comes right straight down this area, and that's that central sulcus, which divides the frontal lobe, which is out here, the frontal lobe, from the parietal lobe, which is back in here. Okay, and what happens is this area right here, that first gyrus that's just in front of that, is called my primary motor area. It's the primary motor area, or sometimes you'll hear it called the motor cortex. That's the area there. It's a band of a gyrus that's just in front of that central sulcus, and that's called the primary motor area. Just below that, okay, is another area called the premotor area, and that premotor area would be the area right here, just a little bit in front of it, that gyrus in front. Now that actually gives an assistance to the area, the primary motor area. It's not nearly as prolific as we find in the primary motor cortex, but it can help. And sometimes people, when they do have like a stroke, a CVA, cerebrovascular accident, and when they lose a lot of this motor cortex and result in a certain level of paralysis, sometimes they could actually develop some things in this premotor area, or that secondary motor cortex, or the accessory motor cortex, that will help them regain some function after that. So that's my primary motor area right here, where the purple is, and that's my secondary or my premotor area, where that light blue would be. Now this is Broca's area. If I look at Broca's area is going to be right about in here, this area right here, and that's the area that's responsible for motor speech activity, and that's where we sort of have our speech, the motor activity that's coordinating my speech, controlled from there. And sometimes you can actually tell my motor activity doesn't work very well, but that's okay. Okay, hopefully you understand what we're talking about. So this is looking at the motor cortex, okay, that we see. We also have, I just mentioned here, I just put it in for the heck of it, Wernicke's area. And I mentioned this before. This area right here is called Wernicke's area. If you can see it, let me get it a little darker green, be able to see it a little bit better. This area right here is called Wernicke's area, and that's where we have sort of integrative speech centers, not so much that involve the motor activity of speech, but the processing of speech. You know, the right words, the right syntax, things like that, and that's called Wernicke's area. Okay, so that's what we talk about with motor cortex. Now, and this is just another image here that we see. So right here would be that central sulcus. If I drew a dark line right down here, my central sulcus is going to come right down here, and this would be the red area would be my motor area, and this area would be my secondary or my premotor cortex, which might be somewhat assistant to my primary motor cortex. But this red area is the main part that we're talking about. Now, I mentioned before that what happens is this motor band, this motor cortex, this strip, this gyrus that has this motor activity, is represented by various areas. Okay, the areas that need more fine-tuned control have a larger representation. Areas that don't need as much have a smaller representation. So let's just look at this, what we're talking about. If we look at, let's say, chewing, swallowing, tongue, vocalization, lips, look at the amount of that area along that band is involved with just those things. If we go up a little farther, let's talk about the thumb, the index finger, the middle finger, the ring finger, the little finger, the fingers, the hand, the wrist. Well, look at this area of representation. It's out of proportion with the size of the body. My hands are small, my face is relatively small as compared to the rest of my body, but those are areas that really need a lot of control. Okay, so because they need a lot of control, their representation in that motor cortex is quite large. Finally, I get above the wrist, I get to elbow, shoulder, trunk, you know, hip, knee, and then the leg down, actually in that area of that longitudinal fissure down inside the center portion of the brain. So anyway, that's what we see, and this is called the homunculus. Okay, and this is just another representation. Let me get rid of those things right there. Let's get rid of those. And this just shows the same thing in regards to if I'm looking here. You know, this area in here that involves the tongue, the jaw, and stuff like that, quite large area. If I'm looking in this area up in here, hand, finger, stuff like that, that's also a very large area as compared to everything else. Okay, and that's the way that the cerebral cortex works in regards to its representation. Areas that need more control have a larger area of representation in this thing called a homunculus. Now this is a homunculus. Okay, if we look at it now, what they've done, this is sensory over here, which is very similar to motor, and we have a sensory homunculus. We also have a motor homunculus on this side. We look here, and so this is the cerebral cortex. This would be the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure would be right down here. Okay, so this would be the lower portion of that frontal lobe, just anterior to that central sulcus. Look at the face. The face is a very large area representation. Why? Because I need a lot of fine-tuned control. Look at the hand, and then here's the back, here's the buttock region, here's the thigh, here's the calf, here's the foot. Who cares about them? I mean, they're small, and they don't need as much fine-tuned control, so the area in the homunculus is relatively small. And you'll see the same thing in the sensory homunculus, where what happens, areas that need more sensation. Look at my fingertips. With my fingertips, you know, if I'm looking at hand, wrist, little finger, and all the way through thumb, it's this whole area. Why? Because I need to be able to feel things. I have to be very discriminate in regards to how I feel things, and that's what we see with the sensory homunculus as well as the motor homunculus. And so this is just another image looking at that homunculus, where we see face is large area, hands large area, and the rest of the body has a relatively small area. And this is down that longitudinal fissure right there. And we see the genitals, toes, foot, leg, and thigh and hip and stuff like that down in this area. Okay, so basically that's the homunculus. And I'm going to show you a little. Okay, this is a warning. Ding, ding, ding. Terrifying picture coming up. There's a homunculus. They've actually taken a little model and made this homunculus. And again, look at huge head. You know, have a monster-sized head. Can't really see it. Monster-sized head here, big hands out in here, and everything else is relatively small. Okay, I do have some recommendations in regards to looking at this homunculus. Let me take let me erase these things so you get a better view of this homunculus. Okay, and if you go to Google and you do an image search, there'll be all kinds of crazy pictures of the homunculus. But if I look at that homunculus, a word of warning: P.S. Don't show this to your family and friends. You know why? It'll freak them out. So as a result, they'll say, "Oh, that's not you." You know, oh, you want to see my baby picture? And you show them the homunculus. I think they'd probably freak out. But that's what the homunculus is really about. Okay. Now that sensory cortex is very similar. Now where is it at? Now we talked about that central sulcus, that central fissure, that the portion anterior to that precentral gyrus is motor. The part that's just behind that central fissure, that central sulcus, is called the sensory area, the primary somatosensory area. That's the post-central gyrus, pre and front, post-central gyrus behind. So when we talk about the primary somatosensory, it's just posterior to the central sulcus in the post-central gyrus. That's going to be, it always comes up as a test question somewhere. Maybe this year, I don't know, who knows what's going on with testing. So that's called the primary somatosensory area. There's also a secondary somatosensory area that's adjacent to it, just posterior to that. We have that primary visual area, which is at the occipital lobe. Okay, and again, if I look at the occipital lobe, we know that longitudinal fissure divides the right occipital lobe from the left occipital lobe, and tucked inside that longitudinal fissure is where most of that primary visual cortex area would be. So it's next to the longitudinal fissure. We have a primary auditory area, and this doesn't take a big leap of faith or understanding to understand. That area is right by the ear. It's on the side of the head. Exactly, we have it close. The nerves don't have to go very far. So the primary auditory area is in the superior portion of the temporal lobe near the lateral cerebral sulcus, very where that lateral cerebral sulcus is that divides the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobe. We have a primary gustatory. Gustatory means hunger and food, eat and feeding and stuff like that. And that's at the base of the postcentral gyrus, just superior to the lateral cerebral sulcus. And I'll show you exactly where that is. And a primary olfactory area. And the primary olfactory area is actually on the temporal lobe on the medial aspect. Now, if we go back and remember that, looking at that skull before, remember the ethmoid bone, which we saw in the cranial, the anterior cranial fossa, with all those little holes in it, and right in the middle of it was that thing that stuck up called the crista galli. Those little holes are where the olfactory nerves from the olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve number 1, comes, and when the bulb of the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, gets to that point, sits in those little troughs in the cribriform plate and goes down through those little holes, okay? And then supplies sensation, a smell sensation to the higher portion in my nose, okay? What happens is the olfactory nerves come back, and where they attach to the brain is very close to the area of the temporal lobe on the medial aspect. Okay, I always show you that on another diagram somewhere else, but I didn't think I put it on there here. And again, let me get rid of these lines here again, get all those out of there so we could actually see what we're talking about. And basically we're talking that this blue area right here is basically the area of my primary somatosensory cortex right here. So it's the post-central gyrus. Again, when I look at where that diagram is, here's my central sulcus again, right down here, following right down here, that's my central sulcus or central fissure, and what happens is this post-central gyrus right here is my primary somatosensory area, this area right in here. And we have a secondary somatosensory area if I look right here, and that's basically over in this area, just adjacent to it, the gyrus that's adjacent to the post-central gyrus. Okay, so that's where my sensation is. Motor would be this area. Sensory is going to be in this area, just behind. The motor is in front of that central sulcus or central fissure, and the sensory is behind it. Okay, so that's what we see with that. This is my primary visual area. This is occipital lobe back in here, and again, most of my primary visual area is tucked inside that longitudinal fissure in that occipital lobe area that we have, the region. There's some secondary area visual association centers, which is more on the external portion of the occipital lobe, but most of the primary visual is in the occipital lobe, tucked inside that longitudinal fissure on opposing sides. Here's the primary auditory area. Makes sense, because if I look right here, here's my temporal lobe, and here's my primary auditory area. Where is it? Right by the ear. So the ear would be sitting right there, so a nice close distance. That would be my primary auditory area. This would be a primary gustatory area, would be right in here, involving things like hunger and feeding would be at that area. And again, that's my sensory cortex that we see. And this is the same homunculus that we talked about. Here's the motor, again, in that precentral gyrus. Here's the postcentral gyrus right here. So that central sulcus would be sitting right, along that area. And so this is the postcentral gyrus, and this is that sensory homunculus. Okay, I'd never put on a diagram what's here. That's stupid. I just remember that what happens is that the face starts inferiorly, and I go up, and the face is a very large representation, as well as the hands have a very large representation. Why? I need a lot of sensation in those areas for them to work well. Now, one last thing I want to just mention before we cut for today is people talk about gray matter and white matter. Okay, when I look at this image of the brain, what happens, I see some various. So if you look here, these look like a cauliflower in here. This would be the sort of the midbrain area, and these dark areas right here are actually ventricles, where some of the cerebral spinal fluid come together in the middle, in that third ventricle. But if I look at this hemisphere here and this hemisphere here, we definitely see some representation of what we mean by gray matter and white matter. If you look on the outside, the superior surface, there's a rim that looks darker or grayer, and that's what we call the gray matter. So it follows around here on the rim. Now, and then inside here, it's lighter, it's still gray, but that's called the white matter because it's much whiter. Now, what makes it gray and what makes it white? What we find is cell bodies of the axons are in the gray matter. The axons reside at the surface of the brain and in this gray matter, and that's what gives it that grayish color. Once that we know that the neuron leaves that cell body, where does it go? It goes out the axon, and the axons here are mostly myelinated. Well, that myelin, that sheath that's around the axon, it provides this whiter appearance, or that lighter appearance that we see in here. So the axon and the myelin sheath provides that lighter appearance here. The cell bodies of the neurons provide that more gray appearance that's up in here. Okay, and basically that's how where they get the word gray matter versus white matter. Okay, and that still helps it a little bit in regards to somebody say, hey, you don't have a whole lot of gray matter. Well, maybe there's a problem there. Okay. So what we talked about today is we talked a little about the division of the cerebral cortex, how it's divided, various lobes, what's in each lobe, where the primary motor center is, where the primary sensory center is, where things like Broca's mechanical speech area, Wernicke's interpretive speech area, hearing, vision, all those things, feeding, hunger, all those things are there, and you should have an idea, a pretty good idea where those are, and those might be very easily testable type questions. I think I would know. So I'd know a little bit about that, how the brain's sort of like divided, as well as frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. I think that's important. I think these are things that are very important. Also the homunculus, and understanding that concept of the homunculus, areas that need more fine-tuned control have a larger representation in the cortex as compared to areas that don't need as much fine-tuned control, which have a smaller area, which results in that homunculus actually means little person. Okay, and basically it looks like a little person, but the homunculus that we draw, or that little statue, which again, don't share with your family or friends, or they'll think you're a little weird. What happens is that homunculus is basically sort of a demonstration of the representation of how the cerebral cortex is supplied by what needs more supply than other areas, and that's what we talked about today. When we get together next time, we'll be talking a little bit about some of the deeper centers of the brain, and following that we'll be talking about the cerebellum and stuff like that, and we'll finally be talking about the spinal cord and the ventricles and the meninges, the membranes that cover the brain, in a later video. But basically that's where we're going to stop for today in Cerebrum. Hopefully all this is making sense to you, and there'll be plenty of chances to ask questions when we finally get back to activity.